maybe you've made the correct choice of like, let's put a little planning and time and thought into how we roll this out, and don't just like toss it out there and hope that it sticks, hope that it, gains some ground, right? I say, if you stream it, it will come is a really bad way of thinking of things. It's just not necessarily the case anymore, unfortunately, especially for a lot of unknown artists.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by Indepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. Today, I am flying solo, but not really. We have a really great guest for today's episode, and we're going to be touching on a topic that we don't often get into on this show, and I'm very, very excited. So I'd like you all to welcome today Mr. Casey Cavaliere to Creative Juice. Casey's from the Wonder Years. He's also a record producer, and we're going to be talking today all about taking the ideas that you have in the studio and bringing them to the global stage, and how to weave an awesome narrative to all of that really takes it from a personal level that you can then relate to your fans in the way that you present your music, in the way that you sell your music, and the way that you bring your art into the world. So Casey, welcome to the show. Stoked to have you, dude.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Very excited to be here once again and share the Creative Juice stage with y'all. It's always a fun time. I love chopping it up.
Yeah, I'm super excited too. Welcome back. I think this is going to be a really fun episode and just kind of a fun topic to bring to the table, because you've worked with a ton of artists and you've also been communicating with a ton of artists and producers on your podcast, The Record Process, which we'll talk about a little bit more as the show goes on, I'm sure. But this is a really interesting topic, and like I said, one that we don't often get into on the show, but I think is really, really important now more than ever, as we kind of, look at a world where bands and artists are not just making music, but they're also creatives in the way that they make content and the way that they present themselves online and the way that they build brands. And I really think and believe that the best of that begins in the creation process in the studio when we're actually making music. So I'd love to kind of kick off and talk about some of the experiences that you've had with that, both in your band, both with the artists that you've worked with, and colleagues and professionals that you've talked with in the industry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said it, and it almost does go without saying, if you are a band or an artist and musician trying to grow right now, then it is no surprise that things are so visually driven, especially with social media platforms and a lot of the tools that are most used to promote the music that we make, right? In the studio, at home, wherever, and tying some sort of visual component to the stories that you're telling with those songs, it can kind of, to a lot of artists, almost unfortunately come as an afterthought, right? When it's like,
For sure.
Time to build out the plan, and you're like, great, the song sounds awesome, I'm so ready, going to kill it. And then, you start diving a little deeper into, okay, it's like, let's, maybe you've made the correct choice of like, let's put a little planning and time and thought into how we roll this out, and don't just like toss it out there and hope that it sticks, hope that it, gains some ground, right? I say, if you stream it, it will come is a really bad way of thinking of things. It's just not necessarily the case anymore, unfortunately, especially for a lot of unknown artists, right? So, that kind of puts the onus on a lot of musicians and artists to start thinking about, I'm using heavy air quotes here when I say content, because I think there's been a demonization of content in a lot of circles and in a lot of genres, and almost like a pushback of like, well, I just want to be the artist. I just want to make music. I
don't want to make content. I hate content.
Right. I don't want to spend 12 hours on TikTok. I don't want to, that's not me. That's not, what I'm good at. And to that, I say, I totally understand. And that there are so many people that are not alone, but you also have to understand, and I'm a firm believer in framing it much differently, in that I think content, as we call it, is really just an extension of the art that you make in the studio, right? It's just kind of telling that same story or extrapolating and evolving that story in one song, 2 songs, 10 songs. And you're just using a different tool set, right? You're telling that similar story or adding to it using a different canvas. In this case, it's not just sonics, but you're layering the visual to make that moment more powerful, and to create what I think is really kind of overall where the industry as a whole is leading, is much more of a experiential kind of place than just a song driven world, right? And I'm not even sure what that could possibly mean, right? Because who knows what, what tech is 5 years around the corner, right? And what app, what platform will rise next. There's always going to be a new one. But I do know that it puts a lot of, not necessarily pressure, but maybe gives artists a huge opportunity to sow some really cohesive things about the making of their music together, to kind of compel people to pay more attention to it, right? And create these bigger, more impactful moments when the song does come out, And a lot of that starts with the process of making it and what happens in those moments, right? So I'm sure many people are obviously familiar with like the obligatory behind the scenes, like studio,
Yes.
Here we are in the studio where, we're doing it, right? You've probably never seen a band in the studio, And that's great. That's a great place to start, right? And I think you've used it. I've heard you use this phrase, and I'm a firm believer in the idea that when it comes to creating video elements to help roll out a song or an EP or a release or whatever kind of project, that it's not necessarily about creating something else, but really a nice place to sometimes start is by documenting what you're doing as an artist and how you're going about it and your thought process as an artist and your creative, intent and goals and message as an artist and how you weave them all together, right? And the studio is a place that artists do a lot of that, right? That a lot of that happens. So taking a look initially, long before you're trying to promote the music, right? Realize that you will also be promoting yourself as an artist always, that is an ongoing story. And one of the chapters might just be you in the studio at the start of making a record, right? And what does that look like? And maybe that doesn't mean pictures and shoving a camera in your face 24/7, because we are there, as you and I were talking before this episode a little bit, to do the deep work, right? To get the best takes, performances, and really put the time and focus where it belongs, which is, yes, on those songs. But at the same time, if we can set ourselves up to capture some of those unplanned moments or really candid, like, sparks that creatively might happen, then we will be in a better place when we do catch those to utilize those later on, right? And I think that's, for me, where a lot of that starts, by trying to understand, hey, how can we capture this while still letting ourselves feel like we can be doing our job as artists and creatives in the studio, and that's a good starting point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good way of putting it, because I think that is kind of an innate fear that musicians have when it comes to this idea of creating content, especially when it's going to be around a release and they're in the process of working on that release. It's like, oh man, but like I'm busy creating here. Like I don't want to be a content creator. I don't want to do that stuff. And I think that that's a real wall that a lot of people hit. And I guess kind of to kick things off a little bit, some of the thoughts on my head is like, there are so many different ways that you can go about doing this that you don't have to restrict yourself into, okay, now it's time for me to turn on the camera and act a certain way for social media to capture the perfect TikTok. There's so many different things that you can be doing. It's, it's down to photos that you take. It's down to, very, very easily, honestly, is like we've talked about this, is like set it and forget it. Set up a camera or a few cameras, a couple different angles, and just allow that to roll and kind of be like an eye in the sky for the process that's happening in front of you. And that can allow you to get content that some of which may not be usable for anything that you actually put out there into the world, whether it's on the internet or somewhere else, but it might inspire the next thing that would come for you. It's just allowing you to kind of have a lens into your world that you could use in a variety of different ways. So I think there's a spectrum of how active you need to take this versus how passive. But I think the important thing is to think about it from the jump and start doing something. You can select any number of ways that you might want to start this process. That way it's, you know, it is cohesive. There's some narrative that you can weave kind of from day one. And Ed said this a couple episodes back when we were talking about storytelling and how like the art of storytelling is more important than ever today for creatives. And, you know, it's funny because as musicians, and songwriters, we're telling stories in the songs that we make. And in so many ways, like there shouldn't be a wall between that and the content that you make. Just like you said, it's kind of a natural extension. The content that you make, as much as we might hate the word content, the ancillary things that you create to promote your music can all be tied to each other. It's not a separate or divided thing. And I think when you start to think of it that way, it becomes really kind of like a sky's the limit sort of scenario of like, oh, okay, like there's so many ways that I could go about capturing this and starting to document.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and, you know, so you mentioned the idea of even just like, you know, passively capturing, right? But also like there's an active element to that where when you start setting up and planning, you know, your assault on making the record, right? You know, even before you step into the studio, right? Maybe it's like there are writing sessions that are happening. I do a lot of this either with the podcast or, you know, with artists that I work remotely with, right? We'll do like songwriting sessions or like pre-pro sessions on Zoom in Riverside, right? Back and forth. And even just capturing those, I'm doing it right now with the band that I'm working with, right? We're not even sure where it's going to go, but the cameras are rolling in that sense so that if an idea does happen in real time or something sparks, one, it's a great way that it's documented and we can go back and be like, hey, I remember that like halfway through that conversation, we had a great idea. Let me go refresh my memory by listening to the conversation, which is cool. But you can also take that and chop it up. And then when the record's out and the song's finished, be like, hey, this was, you know, maybe this was actually the original lyric, or this was actually the idea that we had, but it turned into this. So you can do a really interesting before and after, which I see a lot and can be really compelling to even take like, here's the demo and then just like mash it up to, you know, the final version. So you can see how it changed, how something evolved, right? So the songs in and of themselves as a work and as a project have a story to them, right? Sometimes there's a villain, sometimes there's adversity, right? Sometimes there's a hero and maybe it's not the band, right? You know, maybe it's somebody else that saves the day because they had a backup hard drive when they thought the whole record was gone, right? Whatever it might be, keeping track of those moments and planning ahead. And if you can, this is why I say too, and with Wonder Years, we did this with our most recent record, even from day one, because the circumstances of making it were so trying and so weird, we said, hey, we need to have someone with us, you know, filming this. It can't be us because that'll take all of us too far out of it, right? But what if we could have someone, and it would have to be a really special someone that's really good at being like the fly on the wall, but we all trust, so it doesn't feel like we have to perform or we feel oddly like awkward or encumbered by their presence.
Right.
And if you can find that person and plan ahead for that person or a person like that to be there at all of those checkpoints along the way, then when inevitably whatever narrative does develop, you can tell that later with the pieces that you have. And I think that's a lot of times less than trying to figure out and curate an exact narrative. One will emerge as long as you were able to kind of passively document and timestamp some of these things. And then the other thing that I mentioned too, that I think is a really powerful tool and an interesting idea as well, is that sometimes it's not even the things that are used, or maybe they won't even get used in the final push or as marketing assets for a record release or a song release campaign, but they might actually help you as the artist teleport yourself back to the time of inception when you had that idea, when you were really inside of the writing of that song, the writing of those lyrics, or sewing together that last little bridge in the studio, whatever it might be. And that can be really tough to put ourselves back in that headspace. But that's exactly what we're asked to do 2 years later, when an album's finished and finally released. And people, interviews are asking about it. You're asked to give like pull quotes or to, go deeper on the meaning of a song or where it came from, right? These are all things that like that can even help you generate quote unquote content in its own way about how you tell the story and how you dig in on the influences, the things that like empowered you to take that chance, the things that motivated you to write that song and write it the way you did, right? You know, those are things that you'll want to remember and are things that can turn into other pieces of content, down the line. So I think that's also a really interesting way to look at it is these are ways to remind yourself, even if you just like kind of let a voice recorder roll, while you're workshopping a song in the control room and trying to write something.
I really love that because that's an angle that I think isn't discussed often at all. Is like a true benefit of documenting in that way, like the fly on the wall style documenting, isn't necessarily that every single piece of that, every bleeding minute of that video becomes content for social media. It might just serve the purpose of reminding you what state you were in, how you were feeling, how you were acting, what you were writing about, the emotions, the way that the light hit the wall. It might remind you of that for later when you do have to create content for it, or when you do have to do an interview or whatever it might be, or whenever you need to create, like you said, the marketing assets for the record. And if that's all that does for you, that's a huge win and is leaps and bounds. I talk to artists all the time at our agency, especially around album release time, when they're coming out of the studio and they're like, okay, like I put together this work of art that I'm so proud of. Now I need to figure out how to market it. And it's like, okay, well, like, have you thought about that at all? No, not really. And it's like, oh, well, then it becomes way more difficult to dig up the emotion. I mean, I think we've all seen interviews or videos or marketing content from a band that's putting out a record or an artist that's putting out a record, and knowing like, yeah, they were kind of just like, they were halfway feeling what they were saying right now about a record that they made 2 years ago. And that kind of sucks as a fan to see. And also, like, it kind of sucks for you as an artist to be put in that position to have to be there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was thinking, as you were saying that, even, it's less about trying to, spoon feed word for word, letter for letter, exactly the point of a song, right? A lot of that, obviously, the artistry is in the lyrics, and some artists like to leave some of those things to interpretation, and that's okay. But I think even more so, what's important, as I mentioned at the top of this, is realizing that your whole career as an artist is creating and kind of curating experiences, or one ongoing experience for someone that's following you on these platforms and following everything that you drop, as an artist throughout your career. And the whole idea of putting a song together is it, like, in its own way, trying to capture and bottle a feeling that you get and an emotion, and either that's through the retelling of a story, right? And that's through like using language and visuals and painting a picture for someone, that you're trying to evoke a reaction from an audience, right? A feeling inside of them. So thinking about it in that way, capture these little reminders of things that give you those feelings, right? So it might be something as simple as using the powers of observation that you have on a daily basis as an artist. Maybe you're not even in the studio, but you see a sign somewhere, on someone's front lawn, or you see like a graffiti tag on the door somewhere, or you see another human interaction across the corner. And it gives you this like rushing wave of whatever it is, good, positive, like sad, joy, negativity. Take a picture of it, or just write down like that time and place, you know what I mean? Or just even like tag your location there for later and screenshot the pin. It's something that's going to remind you, oh, I saw this messed up thing, or I saw this incredibly beautiful thing there. So the next time, and this is a great songwriting tool as well, it's like cataloging these inspirational moments that feel like they evoke this thing. Because if you can, that's the hardest part, is to go find that, because you can't all of a sudden just poof, have a guitar out of nowhere on that corner when that thing happens and just write the perfect melody to accompany that, But it's the same way where if a photo of something or you looking at something gives you that emotion, then there's a good chance that it might do that for somebody else, even if it's not completely attached to that exact song at hand, right? It might be attached to a song that you write later on, and it's just up to you to sew those two things together, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, I think as creatives, we innately know that when it comes to the art, and we totally miss the mark when it comes to the business and the marketing. So I think that that's such a good point. Actually, like I can think of a personal story, like years and years and years ago with an old band of mine. We put out a record, and I remember during the writing and pre-production phase of that record, I was down the shore and I was working on a song, and I went for a walk, and I saw, I think it was a street lamp. I saw a street lamp, and I was like, man, like, I saw that. I took a picture of it with, it wasn't an iPhone at the time. I don't even know what kind of what kind of phone it was, but I took a picture of it and went back to the house that I was staying in and finished the song. And then that picture ended up being the album art because it represented so much of what I was feeling in the moment of that creativity. And I guess what I want to point out here is like, that album art, which is a marketing asset in and of itself for the record, wouldn't have happened if I hadn't have taken the second to just take that quick picture, because I was like, oh, I feel like taking this. Like, this feels emotional to me on some level, no matter how big or small.
Yeah. And sometimes I can really relate to that as well. I got a lot of mileage, and for a while, even while we were doing the album, I actually had one of those like kind of like lumography, like point and shoot, like mini, like Instax cameras, but you could do like multi exposure things with it, and it was a fun little thing, but it was also really easy, and it was ostensibly just a point and shoot, right? You know, you weren't over complicating something with like a seriously like fancy lens, kind of camera. And I brought it everywhere I went, and I just sat it down when we were in the studio. I just sat it down and always made sure there was film in it, so that anybody in the band could just pick it up. Anybody in our studio at True Level could just pick it up this was when we were doing the first season of the podcast, right? And could just snap a picture, whether it be of a piece of gear or of each other, or, okay, yes, I got the award for like worst dad joke, and, Tom decides to document it. The camera's right there, and so over time, and I don't think they're in here. Actually, I have a a little like Wonder Years like comic book style lunchbox that we did many years ago out there, and it's actually full of all of these Instax Polaroids. A lot of them are from the whole like 1.5 to 2 year process of making The Hum Goes On Forever. And then some of them, I have another whole stack that is all from like True Level and studio specific. And I used and laid them out as part of a collage. And that was for a while, some of the assets that I used to kind of show the ongoing chaotic narrative of what making records in the studio can kind of feel like. It's all over the place. It's gear, but it's people, and it's action, and it's not always super clear, right? So it's really interesting. And that was an easy way to keep something at hand super quick and document it. And lo and behold, there were a few moments where, even in the past, we're like, we want to talk about this moment when this happened. We're actually going through this right now for another reason that I won't yet speak of or mention, but having to kind of travel backwards about a decade or so and kind of like write essays and tell some stories about decisions that we made back then. And what am I going to do? I'm going to go and look 12 years back in my phone, and something in there, and everybody, my girlfriend and many other people are like, dude, you got to empty your phone. You got like 20,000 pictures. And I was like, that's why I got that's why I got a bigger phone. This is why I got a bigger phone, because now albums are starting to get real old and starting to like turn 10 left and right from our career. But it's also a really interesting way for me to go back very quickly, and be reminded of those things and be able to tap into that, to kind of put forward an evolved idea. And so I love that. And it's the same reason I think, a lot of people get married and just throw disposable cameras on the table as centerpieces and are like, just take pictures, It's
actually a really good idea.
Yeah. And I've seen people do that. And, aside from, a couple pictures that are probably taken later on in the night. There's a lot of really nice stuff that I've seen them, turn into things. So taking that approach, even, it's just, I don't know, dump a truckload of disposable pictures in the studio for, the month that you're there, right? And see what happens, and then just take one with you, because you're not going to be in the studio 24/7. You're going to go other places.
Yeah. And, another thing I want to touch on here is like what we've talked about is, very documentation heavy, but you can take, if you're feeling really spry as an artist and you're like, okay, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to try to capture some intentional content. That's something that's very normal and useful to do as well. We have plenty of, something we recommend at IndieX, for example, when we know an artist is working on a record, or, whether it's a full album or just a song, is like, okay, capture some B-side performances of the tracks, get that on video, whether it be an acoustic performance or something a cappella, or, whatever it might be, just you and your co-writer performing it out. You can get some really solid content. I have tons of examples of artists who have done that and then actually ended up using it as like the leading video ads for their record as opposed to the music video.
I bet you do. I bet you see some wild stuff with the way things perform. And that's why, especially, and sometimes certain things, of course, are genre dependent, right? Different genres have different assets, different instrumentation, different, performances look differently. But does TikTok and Instagram not love a good playthrough video? Like there, and then YouTube. So this is why I say it's like, are you in a band and you're like, say you're in a metal band, right? I love this analogy because it really presents some pretty visceral imagery if you need it to, as an example, right? So you're in a metal band and your guitarist is like world class, just like left hand on fire, right? Then maybe if he's down, get a few takes of him tracking the blistering solo in the leads, in your like lead focus track, right? From the album. Because if he's down to do it and you're capturing takes anyway, you can use that as a playthrough video later over the, he's tracking it to the click. You can use it over the actual solo.
Right.
And, and repurpose it in the same way you can do a full drum playthrough of like, okay, cool. Your drummer's probably going to start out tracking the song, depending on the producer, all the way through once or twice to get the groove and get the feel, right? Maybe the hits aren't perfect or on or articulated. Who cares? Pair it with the, as long as he's to the curated click track and he's okay with it. Those are warm-up takes anyway. So just as long as he's okay, ask him, be like, hey man, can I just like put the camera here on a tripod or a few angles? Also, in that world, you get to a certain level, especially if there are sponsorships or other like music partnerships. That's a great way, when it comes to like brand partnerships and brand relationships.
Oh, yeah. So good.
For those things to get reposted, right? It's like the companies that are giving you either free stuff or discounted stuff to, to promote and play their stuff are going to love that and are going to be elated to push that stuff out through their stuff. And it's free promotion for the band and for the song that you're playing, So that's a great way to start thinking in that world. And the gear world as well, if you're talking about being in the studio again, right? It's like that supersedes everything, if the producer probably has relationships there, right? If you're getting gear and, gear shots and photos of them in action at the console or using something, a pedal in the background, that's easy stuff to just like, hey, throw them a shout out in this, because why not? And it was a cool part that made the sound, made the record what it was. It's what everybody wants. Everybody like wants to be included in the story a little bit, so those shout outs, and you don't have an opportunity with those shout outs if you don't kind of intently be like, hey, let me make sure I grab this because this producer is sponsored by this company, right? That's not the end result, but if they're cool for it and everybody's down, then why not, So it's something for everybody to gauge. And as long as it doesn't get in the way of the workflow, that's definitely, time is usually pretty precious. So that's top of mind. But if you can find a way to do that and everybody's cool, it can put you in a really good place.
Honestly, like if I could give any piece of advice right now, after we just kind of rattled off some of these examples and things that we've seen and ideas that could be like, literally like pause this podcast right now and just jot down these big umbrella ideas, because then if you've just got a back of your pocket, like back pocket kind of note that you can go into the next time that you're going to create something, whether it be a record or whatever it is that you create, you can have a sense of like, okay, here are some of the things that I could be doing. Then it will literally take away all of the stress of like, oh, I need to figure out the logistics for that. Casey and I literally just gave like 4 or 5 examples of things that you could do with very little extra added work that would pull you out of the deep work of actually creating. These are all, pretty easy things that can be done while you're in the process of creating without you needing to touch it, or off to the side later when you're taking a break. I think that that's a really easy way to kind of just have them there for you to use. It's as simple as a quick little checklist.
Yeah. And even if you're going to do, this is a bit more like documentary style, right? But if you think about it and have enough wherewithal, if something really interesting does happen, say you're doing scratch tracks as a full band, or you just completely flipped the arrangement on its head of a song and everybody's mind is blown, cool. You're taking 5 minutes, right? So you can export it, bounce it down. Take it aside. If somebody wants to go talk like first person to a camera, go tell that story about what just happened real quick. Even if it doesn't go on the internet and you have to like wait and you're being super secretive about it, for the next couple months, do that now, because you will remember all of the visceral details that are really important in that moment. It goes back to the reminder. And then maybe you can use it down the line as well if you do piece together some sort of like documentary short or something that accompanies the record.
Where I think artists can actually draw a lot of inspiration from, and this is going to sound silly, but I've actually been watching a lot of food YouTube channels recently. And if you go watch people who cook on YouTube, there's a lot of really great ones out there where like it's literally just a camera or a camera person and them talking to the person cooking, talking through a recipe and doing things in real time. One of my favorites is this channel, Salt Hank. I'll link to it in the show notes. He's amazing and hilarious. And I think it's a really great thing to look at for when you're in the moment of creating something, how you can, document and allow something to be a fly on the wall and not distract you too much from what you're doing. And then, like you said, intersperse, talking points that you do later. You can cut those into a video. Right. That's the kind of thing where like, again, I actually think we talked about this on the last time that you were on the show when we were talking about The Hum Goes On Forever, big release extravaganza weekend. You mentioned like drawing inspiration from other industries.
Yeah.
Look off of the content of other types of creators besides just musicians. And you can definitely, I think the way that you find what resonates with you is just watch something and be like, oh man, that made me really, really stoked or happy or excited to see how they did that. Like the food thing. Like, that just kind of lit me up when I watch it. Yeah. So take what brings you joy, as woo-woo as that sounds, and try to apply it to what you're doing.
No, Marie Kondo the crap out of it, right? And this is this is actually interesting enough. Almost exactly what you just described doing is an exercise I sometimes use with a few of the artists that I coach or kind of walk through and consult on, like, project rollouts and things like that. But a lot of it comes down to like trying to develop a content strategy and like a social media voice. And the first thing I say to them is, instead of trying to like think about like what that is and start from scratch in your head, just put your like consumer hat on, but just keep the observation and try to hone those powers by just start scrolling and stop scroll. And when you stop scrolling on something and you feel like, I got that, gave me a chuckle, or that laughed, or like, oh, this is actually really well done. I tell them, like, screenshot it and just do that for an hour. Sit there and screenshot the things that really make you stop and invest time, because that is ultimately the currency of those platforms. That is what they are all based around, right? So if you can then think about what ideas spark that in you, then that'll be even easier to be like, well, what does that look like if I do that with my project? If I do that with my band? And that's a way better question to start asking, because you already know that the outcome at the very least is aiming for something that brought out an emotion in you. So you know it's very genuine, right? So it's a way of kind of reverse engineering something that's actually super authentic from its core idea. So
I love that, man. Like, let the scroll stoppers guide you.
yeah.
That's so good. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so, so good. And I think something I wanted to touch on too is like, there are a lot of twists and turns that go on in this process, just like anything else when you're, when you're making a record for, I imagine most of you listening, you've been in a studio making music, or maybe you're just about to embark upon it for the first time. You know that things are going to go wrong or things are going to go right and take a completely different turn that you were never expecting. And adding in this content creation or documentation element is exactly the same. It's going to take twists and turns. It's going to take pivots. So taking the stance of I'm just going to document as I go, I think is really helpful in allowing you to work with the pivots as opposed to having like this is firmly how I'm going to get the perfect TikTok or the perfect Instagram reel. If you break away from that paradigm and allow yourself to just create in the same way that you allow yourself to just flow in the songwriting and the production process, you're going to see a lot less friction and probably a lot more output.
Yeah, I will tell you that it's precisely that rigid approach to having the need to feel control over how a plan plays out and how things come together that I think can often be a really huge detriment to a lot of artists and their overall progress. And then I think, in the inverse of that is actually why some early adapters of certain platforms and visually driven platforms are really quick to grow large followings over time because they're way less concerned and way more willing to pivot into something in real time and allow the narrative to unfold as it is instead of trying to like really control it, which I think sometimes a lot of us are like, well, it's got to be so. I had a conversation with an artist I'm working with the other day, and it was talking about how, still really loves almost the kind of like magic and mystique of, man, this band, like this song, like it's so incredible and perfect. I don't want to show the imperfections or like how the sausage gets made, a la Cirque's video recently. We can talk about that later. It rocked me. I have so many thoughts. But it really allows you, I think, when it comes down to taking the time to really just like try to like rigidly sand off and create exactly how something plays out. There's an art to that. But sometimes there's also a perfectionist element to it that can really stifle what's actually happening, and you can really miss a lot of things, right? And so I think it's the same way with telling these things, that if there's something always going, and I said this actually on an intro to one of the podcast episodes recently that'll come out this season. If you stop looking at the problems in your way as like the roadblocks and the friction points and look at like the opportunity to solve them as an opportunity to be creative and find a new angle to take, that's a way better position to be in and a way better mindset, I think, as a creative in general, especially in a way of like, I have to make content, but what's an interesting way that I can visually, take a new approach to this song. If I were going to look at this song, right, it's like a painting. It's like, what would a painting sound like? Reverse engineer it, and then it's like, so I think there's a lot of stuff to be said there if you're willing to kind of see where it goes, and then when it goes there, just make sure you find a way to document or capture it, or just like, again, remind yourself that happened and that was an important transition point, and you can always go back to it and fill in the gaps.
I think that's a really interesting point too, because it kind of lends itself to this idea of the music that we make being a window into personally our worlds, but also just the world that's going on around us at the time. You mentioned before we were rolling, you mentioned talking with Chris number 2 from Anti-Flag about the records that they made and how, they all kind of have a certain snapshot of what was going on in the world at the time. And, thinking about how that could have been applied to content and, what that could be for an artist these days, in 2023. It's so interesting.
That's actually like such a great example, but a lot of bands too are, where their inspiration, what their message is, and their values as people people, not even just as artists, right? Different causes that they might align themselves with, belief sets, things like that are very strongly charged and really powerfully drive the art that they make. That's a whole other avenue to document your process in evolving, as a band, as a musician, right? As a solo artist, is finding a way to capture what's going on outside of just your career, but is directly impacting it, right? And that in and of itself is a way of bringing people into how you're feeling about certain things, the things that are impacting you, but they're also probably impacting them. So it's that connection. It's that shared experience and tapping into that as it goes. And for them, you look at these records and they're almost like they're timeless in their own way, but they're also timestamps of exactly the feelings that and the world events and current events that led up to them at the time. And I think that's a really interesting, reason to frame that, even if it's, not to take this too dark, but we are talking about like anti-flag and politics. So on brand with that, as morbid as it sounds, insurrection was on my birthday, which is January 6th. And so I was like, I got to go buy the newspaper. This is sad. I don't want to, but I got to go buy the newspaper because it's one of those things where, not that my thought was turning it into a piece of content, but it like remembering that this event happened and it brings you back to that climate and that time. And they are a band, they are an example of it, but there are plenty of bands and artists outside that do that. And, if something, whether it's trending at a certain point, and I don't mean that in the sense of like, a hashtag or like trending on, social media, but even just like a feeling and an overall, temperature or tone that it might be trending in a certain world, even if maybe it's musically, right? Maybe like you see things are leaning further towards this direction, or this kind of genre, or is starting to happen. Talking to that, speaking to that, and creating visual representations of how you're interacting with that can really be interesting for people because it gives your take and it shows that trend through the lens of your artistry, right? And through the lens of your creative filter. So
I love what you said about, and I think this is really important for artists to hear, is like when you do this and when you allow yourself to do this, it takes you from a place of my art is revolving around me, and like a little bit of I don't mean this in a negative way, but like a little bit of the, this is my world and it revolves around me, to what I'm creating is a part of the rest of the world and it doesn't revolve around me. It involves my fans. It involves, the rest of humans.
Yeah.
And I think that's what does make music timeless to people. And when you start to think that way in the creation process, and you start to apply that to the marketing. I mean, that's something that I talk about on this show often, that like, it drives me bananas because our artists they're so well positioned to be the best marketers in the whole entire world because we're so creative. But there's this block between like, oh, but it's business and it's icky, but it's not. It's all the same. Like it's one piece of fabric.
Listen, you are the idea of marketing, and I'm sure you've said this as well many times, it's about solving a problem. The easiest way to think about marketing is if you have a product that truly solves a problem or serves a need for somebody, then marketing should not feel icky. The whole goal of it should be to make sure that that person that can actually use and benefit from what you have finds it. And finds it as quick as possible and gets it and solves their problem and fulfills their need. In this case, the need is entertainment. The need is a feeling of community and a feeling of belonging and a feeling of identity, right? These are the things that musicians and the music that they make help people understand about themselves and help people live a better life, right? That's all you're doing. So it should not feel icky to try to put your music into the hands of people if you actually think it can serve them in that way. And thinking about it that way, and interestingly enough, you mentioned, on the whole like documentation kind of thing, I also tend to really like the way that I've heard some people, distill the whole process of writing songs and creating music down to the idea that it's like, art is all around us. Like the universe it's just art. The stories are all there. I'm just kind of pulling them out, of thin air and putting them onto paper or putting them, into tangible form, right? It's kind of all around us. And I think it's the same way. It's like these ideas of how to, package a song or a story or an idea or a feeling are all around us. You already know it. You just have to keep yourself aware of the opportunities you have to do that and think about it and from that standpoint.
Yeah, it's less of I brought this into the world and more of I brought it out of the world. Like it was there, I just grabbed it, and now I'm putting my spin on it and hopefully retelling it to people who feel the same way as me.
It's derivative works of observation, and a lot of them fall into a very small handful of categories if we're looking at the broad scope of popular music. But there's an infinite number of artists that will retell those stories in different ways because those stories keep happening, but at a different time, a different place, and with different people.
One thing we didn't touch on yet, but I feel like this is a kind of a natural concluding point, is like how this all ties into, the way you release a record. And I mentioned like, you and I have both seen plenty of artists in the studio that have put together, performance videos of the songs, and they've kind of led with those. And that's a great way to do it. It also comes into play with like the offers that you make. Coheed and Cambria is a good example of a band that they've got their, woven narrative of concept records, and they've made, comic books around them. To brag on him for a minute, since he's not on the show, when Ed's band, the 502s, put out their record, their first record, they themed it all around a party because they've got that sort of indie folk feel good party vibe. And one of the offers that they made was an upsell to their record. It was a shot glass, and then they had a T-shirt that was "I partied with the 502s," and you can see how, as they were making their record and they sort of captured this vibe, they then wove that into the things that they offered to their fans. And I think that that's so amazing to do. You guys did that with the way that you put out the documentary for Hum.
Yeah.
I think that there's so many great examples of that, and it really all starts at the very beginning, or it can start at the very beginning and make the process so much easier.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, was it Taylor Swift that even, took this to another level, and it's like, had like gave certain fans like one of a kind signed postcards of her either in the studio or somewhere, or I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the 1989 record, I think it was.
Right, which has that aesthetic and has that.
Yeah,
design.
It was Polaroid.
Yeah,
it was Polaroids that came with the records. Yeah.
Right. And so and what a neat anything that you can do, again, like the limited edition stuff, really more so than like trying to like create or inflate market value or something, which I think a lot of people that fall into the greater hater category on this, I think tend to like, frame it as, I think you're making something, it's a way of showing people how much thought and how much intent you're putting into what you're trying to put together, right? And you're trying to do something that's extra special, and sometimes that is not feasible to scale, right? And I think that is the point, that you're trying to do it and trying to show people that really care, that are going to be first there, first in line. Hey, we're going an extra mile to try and make something really special and really powerful for you, right? And in that case, it's like if you have a one of a kind like selfie Polaroid of Taylor Swift while she's in the studio writing that record, I'm not even that, it's like I like Taylor Swift's music, but even I would be like, okay, this is pretty cool, and so, but you can think of it, and it's early on if, a lot of people are still at like the first tier, like early stages, trying to just create awareness, right? There's plenty of stuff that you can do that does not have to be super on the nose, like, here is this, please buy this or whatever. It can be something as simple as trying to think about how to get more people out to your release show, right? And making a special offer around that, right? Whatever that might be. And for us, a band that's at a later stage of their career, you have more to work with. You have more nostalgic feelings and, pieces of work at play. We have even gone back and we still have, it's honestly a scary amount of space taken up on hard drives of old photos that were never used, that we spun through literally millions like of photos have been taken over the course of time, whether it be tour or for album shots or just like side random promos, and we scour that stuff and we've put together for like deluxe releases or like anniversary editions of albums in the past. We've put together like exclusive, we put together a photo book that told the whole story visually, but also through additional additive lyrics and behind the scenes stuff that like we kind of never shared. Also, it's like a lot of this is talking about video or photo. We've scanned in like handwritten journal entries and pages and like,
oh yeah,
I mean,
that's such a good one.
I'll give you a perfect example. I still, in the other room right now, I completely forgot about this until like 2 days ago when I was looking for something. We all had legal pads when we went in the documentary for Hum Goes On Forever. You can see us in the farmhouse that we rented. We all sat down and had legal pads. So as we were all auditioning ideas in a round table, all of us were kind of making notes and making whatever. And the reason that we did that, one, is to, for communication purposes and kind of collecting and downloading ideas very quickly and then sharing them with each other. But then two, we can just pick up all of those notebooks and at some point we can go back, and even if it's just for posterity, just for us, we can be like, oh wow, that's interesting. I had that thought when I first heard that lyric, or oh cool, I had this like the old working title of this song before it actually made it, scribbled out here. And then next to it, I wrote like change key, or I wrote like faster. And then I, whatever it is. Right. And that reminds me, oh, the original version was like way slower than what ended up on the right, whatever it might be. And that's really interesting contextually for people, especially as time allows them to get way more attached to it. Those things are ways that deepen their appreciation and relationship with it, right? And I think you talk about value when you talk about making an offer. Those kinds of things are priceless in their own way. It's like if you have people that are invested enough with your career over time, which I think that's the goal, right? It's like, and it's tough, but that's more of the long-term mindset to kind of go for that. I think I was just listening actually to an episode that you were doing, and it was talking about I think it's a streaming. Maybe it was today that I just listened to it, like talking about streaming campaigns and running like paid traffic for like Spotify campaigns or Reels. But the idea being, it's like overall, holistically, it's a better bet to take an action that's going to help you gain real world fans instead of trying to inflate any one metric or number. And how do you take the temperature of that, right? And so this is a way where if you can bake things into your offer because you thought about something and found a creative idea years before that offer actually goes to market, then that makes it extra valuable and extra special for the people that are going to see it, right? And they're going to know that you thought about it, not at the 11th hour and somebody from your merch company didn't just like spit out an idea and are like, here, I don't know, maybe this. They'll know that like that's something that could only have come from the artist, right? That's something that could only have come from them because they had to be there to do it and they had to be there to like really believe it and want to do it. So I think that's the goal.
I love that. That's a really good point, and I've never touched on that before. Like, fans can tell, and it's good. Yeah. I think it's good. You're right. Like, it's not just like, I guess we throw a keychain in, right? Like, this is something that if it came from day one, man, that does have a massive amount of value to the point of almost being priceless. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, I think that's so cool. Man, this was a great conversation, and like I said, kind of when we kicked off the episode, it's not often something we talk about on the show, is getting into the nitty gritty of, the studio process and how that ties into the later marketing. But I know it's something that you get into a lot. And I know it's something especially that you get to work in a lot as a producer, but also something that you get to talk with a lot of folks about on your podcast, The Record Process. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit because I know as of the airing of this episode, the 4th season of your podcast is going to be dropping. So I wanted to talk about that and encourage all of you listening. If you're a studio head like me or just someone that loves creating music, you should definitely go check out the show. Casey, what's coming up for it? and what can people expect to dig into?
Yeah, I'm so excited for this season. Truthfully, we were talking about this earlier before we started taping here, and I genuinely feel so good. Having just done the ins and outs for this show and kind of going back through. It'll be 12 episodes each season, or 12 episodes. We have 12 different guests. Everything ranging from conventional like legendary producer engineer types to like very much like band dynamics and or solo artist, or even in previous seasons we've had A&R executives from Elektra, and publicists and marketing geared creatives that have talked through their role in the release or creation of a record. So we always try and take a different perspective each week from someone that is involved in the creation of one specific record, right? So we use that record as a case study to talk about the story, the setting, the people involved, and the circumstances involved, not just in the recording necessarily, but the whole phase of the process, the inspiration, the songwriting, the time and place leading up to it, the things that brought those feelings to light. And then even kind of on the other end of it, the reception and how it gets laid out, and how they take some of those intentioned ideas and themes in the record and, use them and bring them to the forefront. For example, with a rollout campaign, like I mentioned, and that was one of our favorite episodes. And we get a lot of incredible feedback. A friend of mine by the name of Jamie Coletta, who has worked on a lot of really incredible records in the punk and indie rock world, talks about getting to know the artist on that level and pulling the ideas and their values out of them and using that as to kind of create the narrative that's already there, but to share that and how to like let people know that it's more than just a collection of songs, right? That it's, there's depth to it, that there's weight to it. And I think that's really important. And that's kind of what we were talking about this whole conversation, and kind of why I started, the record process in general. I think even maybe before I really knew what kind of show I wanted to make, truth be told, is that I wanted to make a show that gave me that feeling, because there were so many other outlets and mentors and creative thinkers, that put those kind of ideas forward and allow me a place to, gain more knowledge, gain insights, and be entertained by stories, but also, learn and feel inspired and keep me motivated to keep consistently pressing the gas pedal and getting in the ring and battling it out with resistance, as Stephen Pressfield will say. That's a reference from The War of Art. If no one's read it, if you're an artist or a musician and haven't read it, definitely read it, because maybe some of the phrases or the things that I tend to veer into will maybe make a little bit more sense. But that's a very powerful book as well. But yeah, by all means, as Jack said, if you're interested in hearing some really in-depth case studies and unpacking the stories of some really great records from kind of an eclectic genre, that's what we aim to do. That's what we do on the record process. It's a lot of fun, and I learned something and am reinvigorated by every episode and every conversation we have. So even if it's not for everybody, it's definitely fulfilling for my heart to hear these artists and musicians and creatives tell their story, the story behind the story, if you will.
I'm sure without a doubt that anyone who is a creative, just knowing my reaction to listening to past episodes, past seasons, I think will really enjoy what you're bringing out, and going a level deeper into the way that these records are made in a way similar to a lot of the stuff that we talked about today. So I'm super pumped for the new season. Congratulations. And I'll make sure we link to the new season of the record process in the show notes so that you guys can dig into it. Casey, thanks so much for being here, dude. This was a blast.
Oh, it was absolutely my pleasure. It's always my pleasure. And I will, of course, make sure, as I have already done in the past, to point anyone from our audience your way, especially musicians that have a lot of questions yet to be answered when it comes to releasing music and kind of making it a career, or even just growing it as a fulfilling passion project. You guys are great at that and have a ton of ideas every week that I think a lot of musicians can really benefit from. So I'm happy to be a part of it, and honored. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, dude. I appreciate the shout outs as always, and excited to be back next week to give you guys more marketing ideas for your music and more creative juice. So we will see you guys next time on Creative Juice. Peace out, Indies.
Can y'all really feel the East Coast, feel the West Coast, feel me? Say what?